Have you ever been writing a piece of music and thought to yourself, I wish there was a way to make this sound more interesting? Well, today we're going to do just that with the power of non-harmonic tones, or NHTs for short. I'm going to be ranking every NHT using this tier list, mostly just based on vibes. If you're not a fan of vibes, that's okay. You can grab a music theory textbook such as this one and attempt to read it. I come now to one of the weakest points of the old harmonic system, to the point where it's suddenly apparent rather usual to discover, and as I said in chapter 4, to which it is patched up so that none is dismissed as accidental. The fact that such and such a man was passing below when a tile fell from the roof, although even that is not necessarily accidental, it can be predetermined too. However, we should be no longer cutting to chance is merely a circumstance that, through the movement of a voice against sustained harmony, chords are formed that we cannot categorize. Chords that the composer, so to speak. If you've never heard of NHTs, consider the following. This is a G minor chord. It consists of G, B flat, and D. If I were to place any of those three notes over that chord, those would be chord tones because they belong to that chord. If instead I used any of the other 9 notes that don't belong to the chord, then I would have an NHT. At this point you might say, okay, cool, thanks, and go do something like this. And maybe that's just the sound you're going for. I won't judge, but if you're aiming to write music that sounds more conventionally pleasing, there are specific types of NHTs that will best achieve that, which are what we'll be ranking. The first of which is the unaccented passing tone, probably the most common of all NHTs. They're approached and departed by step in the same direction, filling in the gap between 2 chord tones. The unaccented part just means that the NHT is on a weaker beat than the chord tones. Let's hear an example. Sounds pretty good, but to me they're just a bit basic. I feel like anyone with even a bit of sentience would come up with the idea on their own, so for that reason I'm going to be placing the unaccented passing tone in the C tier. Reliable, but just not that interesting. Next up is the accented passing tone. These work in the same way as the unaccented passing tone, the only difference being that now we're placing the NHT on the stronger beats and the chord tones on the weaker beats. Let's hear an example. You can hear how swapping around the positions of the dissonance and consonants has created a little bit more tension. I feel like this really adds a lot of extra depth to the music that you just can't get with the plain old unaccented version. It's also quite elegant that it only takes such a simple change to produce. For both of those reasons, I'm going to be placing the accented passing tone in the A tier. Next up is the Neighbour Tone. These embellish a single chord tone with a step away followed by a step back in the opposite direction, returning to the same chord tone. They can also be accented or unaccented depending on how they're placed in relation to the beat, but I'm just going to consider both types together because I don't have anything interesting left to say about metric stress. Let's hear an example. Nice. The neighbour tone doesn't get quite as much use as the passing tone, probably because a melody that mostly emphasizes the same note wouldn't be all that interesting. But sometimes it is nice to emphasize one note, and the neighbour tone is a nice choice for that situation. So I'm going to be placing it in the B tier. Next up is the double neighbour. To execute one of these, we start on a chord tone, then play the upper and lower neighbours of the chord tone before returning to the starting note. These are sometimes also called changing tones and neighbour groups. Let's hear an example. Sounds great. However, if you're not careful here, these can start to sound a little bit jazzy, and this is a video about real music, so having fun like that isn't allowed. For that reason, I'm going to be placing the double neighbour in the C tier. Next on our list is the suspension. This is made up of 3 parts and is probably the most complex NHT on this list. First, we play a chord tone, then while still holding that note, the chord underneath changes, turning the note into a dissonance. Finally, the note moves down by step to a chord tone of the new chord, resolving the dissonance. Let's hear an example. These are so beautiful. I think whoever came up with the idea first should be given a Nobel Peace Prize, because I'm sure there would be more wars if suspensions had never been invented. So I'm going to be placing suspensions in the S tier. Next, we have the closely related but unfortunately named retardation. These are almost identical to suspensions, the only difference being that the dissonance resolves up by step instead of downwards. Let's hear an example. Also amazing. I think people too often neglect these and give suspensions all the attention. However, I do have to deduct points for the poor choice of name. No Nobel Peace Prize for the guy that came up with that one. So it is with great sadness that I will be placing retardations in the A tier. Up next is the Appoggiatura. These are approached by leap and resolved by step to a chord tone. The leap into the dissonance tends to really emphasize it, so these are a great choice for spicing up a melody. Let's hear an example. Sounds great. This is almost an S tier for me, but I just don't think anything is quite on the same level as the suspension, so I will be placing the Appoggiatura in the A tier. Next up, we have the escape tone. These are similar to the Appoggiatura, involving both a step and a leap, but it's been flipped around, so the NHT is approached by step and then resolved by leap. So you can sort of think about it as a backwards Appoggiatura. Let's hear an example. Sounds perfectly fine. Now, remember how I said this NHT resolves by leap? In fact, it's the only one on the list that does this. This might be controversial, but something about that just doesn't sit right with me. It feels like spiritually wrong to do that, and I think we should make it illegal. So for that reason, I'm going to be placing the escape tone in the D tier. Next on the list is the anticipation. These are quite simple and just involve playing a chord tone of the next chord slightly before it arrives, creating a dissonance against the current chord. Let's hear an example. Nice. These are a common choice at cadence points and give you a slightly stronger sense of arrival. I'd say a pretty useful and inoffensive NHT all around, so I'll be putting the anticipation in the B tier. We now come to the final NHT on the list, the pedal point. These occur when one note is held across multiple chords, becoming a non-chord tone in the process. It's most common to hear these in the bass, with the changing chords happening over the top, but there's nothing stopping you from using one in a melody. Let's hear an example. I'd say that's quite a cool effect, so I'll be placing the pedal point in the A tier. But wait, what's this? It seems there's a bonus item on the list. Let's see here, it's called Using a Balanced Variety of NHTs Like a Normal and Well-Adjusted Person. Yeah, that one's going in the S+ tier.